Disappointment is part and parcel of being a moviegoer. Not all movies live up to the expectations, and that's frustrating, but also inevitable. Besides, disappointing doesn't always mean bad, and there are plenty of films out there that didn't quite live up to the hype, but still have something worthwhile to take away. On the other hand, there are some disappointing films that will leave you wishing you never saw them. Films that don't reward their audience in any way and are instead miserable letdowns in every sense. These make for some of the most depressing viewing experiences. So, with that in mind, I'm Ellie for What Culture, here with 10 overhyped movies you wish you'd not watched. Number 10, Empire of Light. Empire of Light was an Oscar bait flop that had all the ingredients for a great success. Sam Mendes as director, a killer cast, Roger Deakins as cinematographer, and many powerful relevant themes, and was instead little more than a numbingly tedious slog. The biggest problem with Empire of Light is that there's far too much going on. The film examines racism, sexual misconduct, mental illness, and the healing power of cinema, but it's so scattershot and rushed that barely any of it lands at all, and what little does work is only thanks to the committed performances from the cast. In the end, there really isn't an awful lot to take from Empire of Light, and the main feeling it provokes is one of intense frustration. The film does flicker to life occasionally, and it's entirely evident that there was potential for something truly awesome here. Alas, it wasn't to be. It's never enjoyable to see something that sounded so good squander so much promise. Number 9, The Nun. Fun fact, I am terrified of nuns, so just imagine that the whole time that I'm describing this film to you, I've also got my eyes shut. The Nun was one of the most anticipated horror movies of 2018, and why wouldn't it be? Valak, the demonic nun, absolutely stole the show in The Conjuring 2, and the marketing campaign was pretty terrific as well. One trailer actually had to be taken down from YouTube because it was too frightening. Like I said, nuns are scary. As such, when the film turned out to be the worst film in the entire Conjuring franchise, that was quite the nasty surprise. The Nun is the cinematic equivalent of spaghetti on the floor. It's all a godforsaken mess that bombards the audience with one lame jump scare after another, while also leaving logic and character development firmly out of the equation. Valak, meanwhile, barely even appears in their own movie. Simply put, this was a bitterly disappointing viewing experience in every way imaginable, and it feels too long at only 90 minutes. Number 8, Tron Legacy. Tron Legacy was heavily hyped up and anticipated prior to its release, and not without good reason. The film's extensive marketing campaign did a great job of showing off the film's stunning visuals, and it was always going to be interesting to return to the world of Tron given how far special effects had come since the first film, which was itself a landmark in that field. Sadly, the final film did not live up to the hype at all. George Lucas once said, "A special effect without a story is a pretty boring thing," and that perfectly summarizes Tron Legacy. Yes, the film looks absolutely beautiful, and Daft Punk's score is undeniably dope, but the film's killer aesthetics are completely wasted on what is a truly awful blockbuster. With such a boring narrative performed with such indifference by its cast, it's hard to get invested in anything that's going on. And yes, plenty of anticipated sequels are disappointing, but given that Tron Legacy was so hyped up, and since it's such a cold, humorless, charmless, and soulless watch, it is a real bummer to sit through. The great Jeff Bridges reprises his role from the original, and he absolutely sleepwalks his way through the film. His heart clearly wasn't in it. His listless performance mirrors how you'll feel watching the movie. Number 7, Snakes on a Plane. Snakes on a Plane arrived on a tidal wave of hype back in 2006. Well, any film with that title was going to, really. But even then, the pre-release buzz was impressive considering that this was before the age of social media. The film became an internet phenomenon to the extent that New Line Cinema actually asked for online feedback about the film and added 5 days of reshoots to the film's schedule to implement said feedback. Sadly, the film itself was nothing to get excited about. Regardless of how silly the concept is, it definitely could have worked. There are plenty of examples of B-movies that are genuinely well made and exciting despite their silliness. There's none of that with Snakes on a Plane. It isn't scary, it isn't thrilling, it isn't funny, and the characters have no chemistry with each other. It's just a really lazy and underwhelming film that seemed to think the absurd concept alone was enough to carry it. Number 6, The Devil All the Time. The Devil All the Time is another one of those movies that sounded absolutely awesome, especially with that ridiculously amazing cast, and instead turned out to be one of the worst movies of its year. Sadly, that year was 2020, a year when people really needed a good movie to get their teeth into. The film is little more than an overstuffed cast of dark and mostly unsympathetic characters killing each other and themselves. As such, it's already underdeveloped on a narrative level. But what makes it so much worse is that this is one of the most nauseating types of films. It thinks that it's smart when it totally isn't. For all the film's nauseatingly pretentious dialogue and philosophical voiceovers, it doesn't really say or do anything profound or interesting, instead mistaking being dark and transgressive for having any actual depth. It's just a seriously ugly movie, one that gives nothing to its audience. Number 5. Downsizing. There are disappointing Oscar bait films, and then there's Downsizing. Every year there are plenty of films that are anticipated to be big award contenders and then fail to live up to the hype. That's just what happens with award season. And many of those films, even if they're not as great as expected, are perfectly okay. Downsizing, on the other hand, is a genuinely terrible film. Expectations were raised high by the film's wonderful premise, terrific director, and consummate cast, and these expectations were then dashed by a mind-blowingly dull affair that mostly consists of Matt Damon's protagonist cleaning people's apartments with an insufferable and borderline racist comic relief character. And then, in the final stretch, it suddenly becomes a preachy warning about global warming and the end of the world. But what the hell is this? Downsizing is yet another one of those potential wasting failures that's depressing to sit through more than anything else, and it's one of the worst films by a great director in recent memory. Number 4. The Blair Witch Project. The Blair Witch Project is arguably the best film included on this list, but it's also the epitome of overhyped movies. The film's reputation as a terrifying experience mainly comes from the context of the time. Back in 1999, found footage cinema hadn't really been done before, and the outstanding marketing campaign tricked people into thinking it was actual found footage and not just a staged movie. The 3 actors in the film were actually listed as missing for the first year after the film was released. At the time, when this kind of horror film was brand new and when people thought it might be real, it was no doubt a very frightening viewing. But that was then, and this is now. The novelty wore off a long time ago, and the film mostly consists of 3 enormously unlikable characters walking in circles through the woods and dropping F-bombs. The ending is frightening, but that's about it. Mercilessly repetitive, excessively stripped down, and deeply, deeply boring, The Blair Witch Project is a serious chore to sit through today. Historical significance be damned. Number 3. Blonde. Blonde is the latest attempt to tackle the tragic life story of the brilliantly talented Marilyn Monroe, one which is as tragically relevant as ever today, especially in the wake of the Me Too movement. With the talented auteur Andrew Dominic in the director's chair, critically acclaimed source material, and the excellent Ana de Armas in the lead role, this is yet another film that should have been absolutely great. Should have been. And yet it was awful. Being almost 3 hours of abstract, overly generalized imagery that doesn't really have a story, Blonde is a terribly dull and self-indulgent film as things stand. But ambitious misfires from talented filmmakers are nothing new. What makes Blonde so awful is how repellent it is. The film seems to believe it is critiquing how Monroe was exploited during her lifetime, when in fact it's partaking in the very thing it's supposed to be condemning. By reducing Monroe to a passive, sexualized victim who suffers one horrific, degrading act after another, Blonde is itself deeply exploitative and cruel. The film also received backlash over its treatment of abortion, which was more than understandable. Perhaps it winning the Worst Picture Razzie over Morbius and Jurassic World Dominion was a tad overzealous, but it is an awful piece of cinema. The kind of nauseating film we could all do without seeing. Number 2. Paranormal Activity. When Paranormal Activity first made its debut, the hype machine told audiences that this was one of the scariest movies they'll ever see. But nothing could be further from the truth. Paranormal Activity is little more than a plotless, emotionless sequence of loud noises and doors slamming, all captured by the single most annoying camera operator in the history of the subgenre. In the years between the Blair Witch Project and Paranormal Activity, there weren't an awful lot of found footage films, so perhaps the concept was still fresh enough to frighten some audiences. That's the only way to explain the astonishing success of what is easily one of the most overhyped films ever released in any genre. It's one of those films that was blown so far out of proportion that it was hard not to feel cheated and lied to once the film actually arrived. Paranormal Activity was a waste of time that somehow became one of the most profitable movies ever. Number 1. Prometheus. If there's one film that really failed to deliver on pretty much everything it promised, it is this one. Prometheus was sold as a prequel to Alien, yet the connections to that series are barely in evidence, and whenever they are, they feel inorganic and shoehorned in. The film was also sold as a philosophical exploration of the origins of mankind. Well, this came down to some extremely silly stuff involving these albino bodybuilders known as engineers, which wasn't even properly explained. It boasted a mouth-wateringly good cast. Well, Michael Fassbender is brilliant as the android David, but no one else makes an impact. All of the others are either wasted or wildly miscast, with the decision to smother Guy Pearce in makeup to play an elderly man instead of just hiring an older actor remaining one of the dumbest casting decisions in recent memory. And worst of all, Prometheus looked absolutely awesome thanks to its incredible marketing, but it was instead a painfully mediocre affair. Though skillfully directed by Ridley Scott, Prometheus is an unscary, soulless, bloodless sci-fi horror film, populated by idiotic, underdeveloped characters and featuring more plot holes than you can shake a flamethrower at. It should have been amazing. Instead, Prometheus has deservedly gone down as one of the most bitterly disappointing films of all time.